Good afternoon, everyone, and a warm welcome. I'm Tim Potts, Director of the Getty Museum, and it's a great pleasure to see as many of you as we do here today, almost a full house here in the room, and the many, many more who are attending via Zoom from around the world for today's lecture. You see the title on the screen behind me. So now to our lecture by Professor Ali Mousavi. Ali studied at the University of Lyon in France, where he took his BA in art history and his MA in archaeology. He obtained his PhD here in California in Near Eastern archaeology from the University of California at Berkeley. He's excavated in France, in Turkey, and in Iran, and contributed to the nomination of a number of archaeological sites and monuments on the World Heritage List of UNESCO. He's the author of a book on the site of Persepolis entitled Persepolis, Discovery and Afterlife of a World Wonder. And with David Stronach, he co-edited the book Ancient Iran from the Air. He's published on various aspects of Iranian art and archaeology and holds a particular interest in the archaeology of Iranian empires from Achaemenid through to Sassanian. And indeed also he's taken a particular interest in the history of archaeology, particularly in Iran, but also the Near East generally. He worked as a curator of ancient Near Eastern art at the Los Angeles County Museum of Art from 2006 to 2013. He's directed 3 seasons of archaeological excavations in recent years at the site of Pasargadae, where Cyrus's tomb famously can be seen today. And he is now the director of the Archaeological Gazetteer of Iran project in the Portavood Center for the Study of the Iranian World at the University of California here in Los Angeles. So he's very much equipped to speak to you today as an authority on the subject of art of the empire, monumental cities of ancient Persia. Dr. Mousavi.
Thank you, Tim. I would like to thank twice the Getty Museum for organizing this wonderful exhibition we have, and for granting me this privilege of being the first speaker of a series of talks in connection with this wonderful exhibition. My thanks go to Dr. Tim Potts, Dr. Jeffrey Spears, Dr. Sarah Cole, and also extend my thanks to Lisa Gazzetta and her team, Clark, Ron, and Aaron, for arranging everything and setting up this lecture. So my lecture is going to be visual, but I have a text I'm going to read, and the title of the talk is Monumental Cities of Ancient Persia, but I'm not going to talk about everything for the sake of time, how much I can say in an hour or less than an hour. But we know that the remarkable rise and coming of the Persians on the scene of the ancient world left a number of imprints in the arts, history, and religion of their time. And we know that the emergence of this Persian Empire was not a sudden outburst, and that their rapid and large-scale military achievements went hand in hand with planning and organization. Here I think that there are 2 major factors to be considered, individual and collective. On the individual level, it took the strong presence of charismatic rulers like Cyrus and Darius, who brought the political unification of an immense area from the Aegean to the Indus. And then on the collective level, the participation of a large number of nations was essential in providing technological and artistic tools for the creation of monumental centers, networks of communication, administrative apparatus, and an economic system of production and distribution. We are in the 6th century before Christ, more precisely the second half of that century, going for, let's say, the very first decades of the 5th century as well. And this is a milestone in ancient history. The old kingdoms are falling apart. The kingdom of the Medes, the new Babylonian kingdom, the Elamites in southern Iran are no longer a significant or important power, and the wealthy Lydian kingdom of Croesus in Asia Minor is approaching its end. For the Persians living in southern Iran, here, the Greeks were on the periphery of the world, or their world. And the universe consisted of a series of interconnected regions stretched from the Indus to the Nile, from the Caspian to the shores of the Persian Gulf and the Arabian Sea, a millennial world of old civilizations. The center of philosophy is not in Athens, it's in Asia. In Miletus, for example, where Thales works on geometry and arithmetic adopted from ancient Egyptians and Babylonians. And we should not forget his disciples, Anaximander of Miletus, Pythagoras of Samos. In Ephesus, Heraclitus develops his doctrine of fire, a thinking and intelligent fire that leads to illumination if respected, or to destruction if in the case of disobedience. And isn't this a reflection of ancient Iranian religion? Or isn't this what inspired later the French, 20th century French philosopher Gaston Bachelard, who says that it shines in paradise and it burns in hell? It's in this time that we find the book of Isaiah that predicts the coming of the Messiah. Who's that Messiah? Cyrus. On the southeast side of the Caspian Sea, here, the message of Zarathustra, spreads. And further east, we have China with Confucius, and later in Bengal and the Indian subcontinent, those two regions embrace the teachings of the Buddha. And this is the world in which were born, grew up, and rose Cyrus and Darius of Persia. Iran has a very long architectural tradition, with the main construction materials being in mud brick. Mud brick is very flexible, easily and cheaply made. You can make mud bricks on a daily basis, hundreds or thousands of them. It's an excellent heat and cold-proof material as long as it is maintained regularly. And one of the novelties of this new dynasty, the Achaemenids, the Persians, was the general use of stone in their architecture, in contrast to the traditional materials in mud brick, burnt brick, and wood. And above all, a successful marriage of these two traditions. Not that Iran didn't have stone, but the tradition was to make structures, architecture in mud brick. This transition of change in the construction methods took place under Cyrus, who brought stonemasons, architects, and builders from conquered lands, from Mesopotamia, Anatolia, and Asia Minor between 546 and 539 BC. However, it was under Darius, or Darius, that a successful combination of Iranian and Western architectural traditions reached its zenith in beauty and excellence. So this is Persia, Fars, that province that would take the name of their new inhabitants, or we know that the Persians were immigrants who came from the northwest and settled down here. This was the land of the Elamites. This was the highland, the land of Anshan, of the Elamites. And our sites are here, major archaeological sites of Pasargadae, Persepolis, and Naqsh-e and Susa. From the old capital city of the Medes, Ecbatana, or the gathering place of the Medes mentioned in Assyrian texts, we don't have much to offer or to say, because Median Ecbatana or Ecbatana is yet to be discovered. And we have evidence for the presence of Achaemenids at the site, as you can see, but we don't have any surviving monument from that northern site of Hamadan. And we have not yet discovered remains of any monumental structure prior to the reign of Cyrus II, Cyrus the Great. And the earliest manifestation of a Persian monumental art is to be found here at Pasargadae, in northern part of Persia or Fars. The choice of the site was apparently symbolic, and classical sources tell us that Pasargadae was the battlefield, the place of a battle between the Persians and the Medes, and Cyrus decided to erect monuments there to commemorate his victory over Astyages, the last king of the Medes. The building program at Pasargadae shows artistic influences from other regions, notably Media, Babylonia, Ionia, and Lydia, but also from the Levant, maybe Phoenicia, or maybe Egypt. The dates of the site's constructions range from 545 BC to 522. Here's a view of the site taken from the top of the citadel. This is the citadel. In fact, Pasargadae is the site of the oldest surviving park. And it was a park, it was a parkland furnished with monuments. It was never a capital city. It was the residence, let's say a lofty residence of a ruler whose tomb was here, who occasionally lived there or stayed or spent a few days there. You know that Cyrus spent most of his life on horseback conquering countries, and he died in battle in the northeast. As for the monuments, as I said, there was this huge citadel. We don't have the, let's say, superstructures were in mud brick. We have the lower part of the facade of that citadel in stone. This was excavated twice by Ali Mousavi, an Iranian archaeologist, and David Stronach, who found a copy of the Daiva inscription of Xerxes, and you have an exemplar here in the exhibition. I believe this one is in Babylonian, and the one that Stronach dug up is in Old Persian. Here's David Stronach, my mentor, with Martin Weaver and Mahmoud Aram, an Iranian archaeologist, and workers. The photo was taken in 1963, the last season of his excavations on behalf of the British Institute. And we know that Ionian and Lydian masons were at work at the site of Pasargadae. We have these, this facade of the citadel is in ashlar masonry, carefully dressed blocks of stones put together with clamps. And sometimes we find these tiny signatures. And these are, in fact, masons' marks. Groups of masons worked here, and each group left their signature on these stones. We know that the tomb of Cyrus is a monumental, I don't want to say copy, but a monumental form of earlier structures found in Asia Minor. And this is the work of Ionians coming from the west with Cyrus after the capture of Sardis in 546 BC. And so is this building. This is a later building, still Achaemenid, in southern Fars, not yet at Pasargadae, attributed to Cyrus the Younger. And this one is also from the Achaemenid period. Cyrus built two palaces at this site, this Palace P, and then another one, Palace S. This Palace P is where you find traces of Ionian architecture, Ionian and Lydian architecture. But then the plan, the whole overall layout is Median. This is a columned hall, and we know that the Medes built columned halls. So a combination of those traditions. And here you are, these horizontal fluted torus, these column bases. This is definitely Ionian. By the way, this is my former teacher and mentor, Shahriar. I had given the tour of the site to Filippo Montebello, the former director of the Metropolitan Museum, in 1998, I think. More evidence for the presence of Western masons and builders. Here we have two techniques very well known in the West, in Ionia. This technique of anathyrosis, where they left the core of two pieces in stone, rough, so the two pieces could be locked together when they would come into contact with each other, and the use of clamps. Of course, clamps are gone in iron or in lead, but you have the place of those clamps to fasten, to lock blocks of stones. And we know that Babylonian or Assyro-Babylonian sculptors or artists worked there. These are the lower parts of the gates to Cyrus's palatial buildings. In this case, Palace P. We don't have the upper part, unfortunately, but the lower part shows sort of Assyrian or Babylonian influence. And this one, the famous winged figure at Pasargadae. You can see better here on this drawing by Charles Texier. And previously there was an inscription with the naming Cyrus. And we know that, once again, this is inspired. Actually, this is a Babylonian, Mesopotamian work of art, but the difference is that in the case of Assyrian reliefs, everything is Assyrian. Here, you have a hybrid relief or figure. Wings are Assyrian. The garment is Elamite. This hatef or a crown is Phoenician, Egyptian. So this is a combination of, let's say, the conquered lands, the newly conquered lands of Cyrus's empire. We don't have a text here, but the empire's nations are depicted in image here at Pasargadae. There's no significant architectural remains from the time of Cyrus' immediate successor, Cambyses, who spent most of his reign conquering Egypt and whose death prompted the period of crisis and civil war, out of which emerged a strong figure, another founding father, Darius or Darius. And it's thanks to him that we have such magnificent monuments. Susa and Persepolis are his work, as well as the expansion of the empire and its organization and administrative apparatus. So he justly deserves to be called great as well. Darius ascended the throne of Persia in 522 BC, after having triumphed over various rebellions across the empire, the account of which is given in detail here by Darius himself on this monumental rock relief and inscription at Bishapur in western Iran. After the suppression of those rebellions, he had to choose soon a capital city, something that his predecessors failed to do. Pasargadae was no city to accommodate the center of an empire. He didn't like the old, crowded Mesopotamian Babylon. But he knew that the two essential regions of his empire, the plateau of Iran and the plains of Mesopotamia, should be close to his new capital. This is why he chose Susa, that millennial metropolis of ancient Elamites, now in decline. Before him, Cyrus must have passed by the ruined city without leaving any text or building. And Darius himself remembers Susa as follows: I saw the fortifications which at Susa had once been built go to ruin. Me, I raised them again. I built new fortifications. This is how the work at Susa began. It was a challenging project, a testing ground, as Jean Perrault writes, where new architectural forms were elaborated, where the Eastern traditions Perso-Elamite met those of Mesopotamia and Asia Minor. Challenging because there was real demand for splendor, but building heavy structures in stone and brick was not compatible with the nature of the terrain, with its soft ground in a region crisscrossed by rivers and marshlands. I'm talking about Khuzestan, southwestern Iran. But this is at Susa where we find the essence of the Persian resolve by a demanding king, in tandem with Egyptian handling of monumentality, Ionian skills of stone cutting and masonry, Babylonian knowledge of solid foundations and brick walls, and with the best trained artists of the time. All this is reported once again to us by Darius himself in his famous inscription, or the foundation chart of Susa. I'm not going to translate it. I'm not going to read the whole translation for you, but just a few passages of this famous DSF. This is an old Persian. Actually, this is probably the master copy, but then they made other copies in stone, in Babylonian, and in Elamite. Darius says, this palace which I built at Susa, from afar its ornamentation was brought. Downward the earth was dug until I reached rock in the earth. When the excavations had been made, then rubble, gravel, was packed down. Some 40 cubits, approximately 14 meters in depth. Another part, 20 cubits, 7 meters in depth. On that rubble, the palace was constructed. In fact, they raised those ruined structures. They made a, let's say, platform with those side walls. They created a huge box. And then on this, they built, they laid foundations of the palace. He says that, for example, for the construction of the palace, the cedar timber came from a mountain named Lebanon. From there was brought by the Assyrians. They brought it to Babylon, and then Carians, a people from Anatolia, they took it to the Ionians, and then who brought them to Susa. The timber, another type of timber, came from the region of Kerman in southern, southeastern Iran. The gold came from Sardis and Bactria, the two extremes of the empire. The precious stone, lapis lazuli and carnelian, came from Sordiana, present-day Afghanistan or northeast Afghanistan. And turquoise came from Khorasan. Silver and ebony from Egypt. Ivory from Ethiopia. And Sindh, the Indus Valley. The stone quarried from a mountain in Elam, on the Iranian plateau. The stone cutters were Sardians. He mentions them. Goldsmiths were Egyptians and Medes. And he says, Darius the king says, at Susa, a very excellent work was ordered. A very excellent work was brought to completion. Me may Ahura Mazda protect, and Hystaspes my father and my country. It seems that when they deposited that text in the palace, Darius's father was still alive. Here we are looking at a section of this mound, the Apadana. This is the northern mound at Susa. And you see clearly this is a study carefully done by the French team in the 1970s. And this matches what Darius says in his inscription. Look at these foundations in gravel. And we know that, for example, the Babylonians were famous to build on soft ground in the marshlands of their country in Mesopotamia. So foundations were introduced in the form of boxes of gravel, wherever it was necessary to give the palace and its audience hall, that heavy audience hall, a safe footing, in fact. And personally, I had the chance to excavate one of those caissons de gravel, those boxes, not here at Susa, but at Pasargadae, which is much less steeper than those at Susa. It took us 5 hours to cut a section of it by digging a small trench of maybe 16 square meters. It was a solid, highly compact mass of gravel and sandstone. Here, the columned hall, the Apadana, which is an Iranian form of building, had to be built in an environment to which it did not belong. The construction of the columned hall at Susa, in fact, combining the two traditions, that of the highland and that of the lowland, was quite a success. Here we're looking at the royal apartment or the residence and the columned hall or the Apadana at Susa. There isn't much to see at the site aside from the lower parts of the walls and the three interior courtyards of the palace, as you can see here and there. Maybe it's better to see this reconstruction by the famous French draftsman, Daniel Ladiray. The residential part of the palace, or as Jean Perrault calls it, the royal apartment, is in fact a large house that could accommodate some 100 people. It was a very well protected residence with 2 or 3 entrances, one main entrance here and 2 side doors here and there. The access was limited, and we know that each area of the royal apartment had its own doors or gates and could be closed at any time. The residence was also very beautiful. It was beautifully decorated. The floor was plastered in red, and the walls were painted or decorated with glazed bricks. And you have a few examples here in the exhibition. And we know that the site, in 1972, the French team discovered this magnificent Egyptian statue of Darius that had been brought to Susa by Xerxes. But it was made in Egypt. It had been installed in the Hebes temple in Egypt. And here you see something that we'll see in a much, let's say, elaborate form at Persepolis, the representation of the empire's nations with their names in Egyptian hieroglyphics at the base of the statue. And since Susa was a success, why to stop there? And why not to build something that would surpass it in magnificence and beauty? So he went to Persepolis, the city of the Persians, a city that Darius founded around 516, 515 BC, but he would never see his city in its complete form. And the city was later completed by his son and successor, Xerxes. So the layout of this new foundation envisioned a citadel as a core of a larger city, and the city was expanded actually into the plain, adjacent plain, outside the platform. In fact, for this purpose, remarkable preliminary operations had to be done. The first stage was to prepare the promontory of this mountain. So they leveled down a huge chunk of this mountain to install a drainage system and to erect huge side walls. And on top of that, to create a platform, and on top of that, they built palatial structures, such as this big columned hall, the Apadana, or the Hall of 100 Columns, or the Gate of All Nations, and minor palaces or buildings, like the Palace of Darius and the Treasury. The remains of the city are here, outside the platform. I think that some 130,000 square meters of the slopes of this mountain was raised or removed in order to build this platform. We can estimate that all that preliminary work lasted for maybe 5 to 6 years, during which the stone platform was more or less complete, maybe around 515, and this is the time when Darius had his largest inscription engraved on the south wall of the site here, in which he calls this place a fortress. And Darius King says, as for the fact that upon this place, this fortress was built, formerly here, the fortress had not been built. By the grace of Ahura Mazda, I built this fortress, and Ahura Mazda was of such a mind, together with all the gods, that this fortress should be built. And so I built it, and I built it secure and beautiful and adequate. At the same time, his architects worked on, or began to work on, the Apadana, the large columned hall, this one. And this is when they deposited 4 pairs of gold and silver plaques or plates, known as the Persepolis foundation plaques of the Apadana, not later than 511 BC. You have a full description of the site with its that wonderful reconstruction. I think that this is the best you can find these days in the website of the exhibition and also in the immersive experience room. So I'm not going to describe all of the monuments at Persepolis. It would be an endless talk. But let me concentrate on a few sculptures, the reliefs of the empire's delegations. Here we are looking at the Padana Palace, the Palace of 100 Columns is here, part of the treasury here, and other palatial buildings. Forget about these tents. These are from the 1970s, early 1970s. Anyway, this Apadana of Persepolis, the plan is like the plan of the Apadana at Susa, but this one is slightly larger, maybe a few meters. But this one is monumental in that it was built on a podium or raised ground platform, decorated with two monumental staircases. And on the face of those stairways, you have reliefs. And we know that Achaemenid sculpture is always subordinate to architecture. It finds its meaning in connection with the building. And maybe the technical shortcomings or lack of time prevented the decoration of Susa as a Padana. And this is why this was compensated by those foundation charts or texts. But here, they had time to represent the empire's nations in both text and image. The Achaemenids adopted the Assyrian decorative representation in friezes. We know that. But they avoided exaggerated realism and dynamic or Baroque-like representations of figures or events we see on Assyrian bas-reliefs. Everything is moving or moves on Assyrian reliefs. It's very lively. Instead, Achaemenid artists preferred static poses. And I think that the reason was to express a general feeling of peace. There is no violent scene at Persepolis. There is no combat scene between humans at Persepolis. Once again, the over-impression is that these are all repetitious, but if you look carefully, you'll see that they were depicted with care, tact, and variety. And each one's character and clothes are depicted in detail. We'll see that. So the artists who made these figures must have seen the actual individuals in person. Persepolis was a collaborative project of nations, and the great kings wanted to show this in both text and image. As for the textual evidence, we have the Persepolis fortification and treasury tablets, in which you find information in connection with workers. For example, we know that in the second and third year of the reign of Xerxes, there were more than 500 Syrians, Egyptians, and Ionians who were engaged in the construction of columned halls. Which one we don't know. And in year 19 of his reign, some 1,300 workers, named as woodworkers, sculptors, people working on iron doors, were involved in the project here at Persepolis. These reliefs, I think, let me go back to this picture, they are meant to be seen en passant. This is what you get in the immersive room, actually. If you go, you see that everything moves, and this is like a motion picture. And each delegation is guided by a Mede or a Persian. They're all separated by a cypress tree. And each people or delegation brings, or they bring, the most characteristic gifts of their country. such as these Bactrians bringing this double-hump camel. Let's look at these Scythians bringing wool. And then they all have Achaemenid, famous short dagger. Or Ethiopians with elephant tusk and okapi, that rare animals, dwarf giraffe, a characteristic commodity of their country. Or an Armenian bringing a silver vessel, maybe, the handles of which are in the form of two griffins. And we have a handle here in the exhibition in the form of a winged goat, a beautiful handle. So something similar to this one. Once again, the sculptors were either Egyptian, Ionian, or Babylonian. They all worked under the supervision of a Persian master. And I think that this is the message we get. Where do you find in the whole ancient Near East portraits of these people? An Arachosian with this bashlik or hat in wool, or an Ionian, or a Lydian, or a Babylonian. I don't know any portrait of a Babylonian myself, or a Sardian from eastern Iran, Scythian with these pointed hats, or an ancient Ethiopian. Where do you find a portrait? Nowhere else. Here. So here everything is recorded. I think that this is the message. They wanted to show off, of course, the extent of the empire, but also they wanted to convey the idea of collaboration. Persepolis and the whole empire was a collaborative project. I mentioned that different groups of sculptors and stone cutters worked on these projects or at these Achaemenid sites. Here, the first glance, they look like each other. But if you pay attention, you'll see that these two portraits were done by someone, but this one is different. Why? Because you have those sculptors' signatures on top of them. They are different. So these two were made by someone, and this one by a different sculptor. All this has been studied carefully by Michael Rofe in his dissertation, Sculptures and Sculptors at Persepolis, that he published. And we find outside Persepolis another type of representation of those nations. Here at Naqsh-e, maybe 5 to 6 kilometers northwest of Persepolis, this is the royal cemetery of ancient Persian kings. And on the facade of these rock-cut tombs, you see people holding or carrying the throne of the king of Persia. Here the number is 28. I believe on the Apadana reliefs we have 23, if I'm not mistaken. And what's interesting here, actually we have a text by Darius himself. He says, "Look at the image of those who hold my throne. You will recognize them, and you will learn this, that the man of Persia have fought far away from Persia." And I had a chance to actually visit the tomb of Xerxes a few years ago, and I took these photos. These were carved with so much care. It's unbelievable. You see so much details, and there is an order. Always Egyptians and Arabians, they're represented together. Their countries were maybe close together. And then this Ethiopian and Libyan, Or look at this Makan or Makian, someone from southeastern Iran or the area of Oman. He's represented here. And look at the sandals. This is something you can't even see from, these are carved or placed high up on this cliffside of the mountain. Nobody would see them. But you have so many details here and there. Here I would like to avoid the tragic and burning end of Persepolis and the Persian Empire in order to conclude my presentation with a few words about another type of cultural interaction in a different place and in a different time. We know that Persepolis ended in flames in 330 BC, as you can see on this photo taken in the 1970s by my father. These are traces of burnt beams coming down from the ceiling of this room. We are now in the 3rd century after Christ, in Sassanian Iran, ruled by Bishapur I, the second monarch of the Sassanian Empire, whose victorious wars against Rome between 242 and 261 are commemorated in image, in writing, and also in architecture. Bishapur decided to, when he took a large number of prisoners, Roman prisoners, he sent them back to Persia, and he made them work on different construction projects. And one of them was the building or the erection of his new city called Bishapur or Bishapur. Bishapur is in western or southwestern regions of Fars. If you travel from Shiraz all the way down to southern Persia, you go through this road. Here's a view of the road to give you an idea of the environment and the region. This is a tank, actually. This is a pass. And once you cross this pass or tank, you see the other side of the road, everything changes. All of a sudden, it gets warmer. You see palm trees. You are in a different climate or region because you're coming down, descending the Iranian plateau. And there you reach this magnificent large city of Bishapur, built around 260, 262. At least we have an inscription that dates the site to those years. It's a vast archaeological site, excavated first by a French team in the 1930s, and then later by an Iranian team in the 1960s and 70s. They uncovered a series of palaces and royal buildings, and including 2 mosaic halls, beautifully decorated with these mosaics. And you have this one here in the exhibition. This is the one that's now in the Louvre, but we have it here. So go and see it. It's a magnificent piece of art. All this was done by Roman artists of the time. Those whom Bishapur took from different regions, maybe from Syria, northern Syria, or from northern Mesopotamia, to work on different projects. But probably the most challenging of those projects was this one, the one that diverted the waters of the Karun River in Khuzestan. We are now in the southwestern southwest Iran. Here you have two sources, actually, the history of Tabari and the Shahnameh, the Book of Kings. I like Ferdowsi's account of this story. He tells us of a certain Baranush, a Roman engineer in the service of King Shapur. By the way, I couldn't find any good translation in English of Ferdowsi's poems, so I'm going to tell you the story in English, in prose, but then I'll cite a few baits or poems by Ferdowsi himself. He says that apparently there was a Roman engineer named Baranush, and Shapur said that there was a river, this one, the Karon, large river, near Shustar, that was so wide no fish could swim across it. So the king asked Baranush, if you're an engineer, build a bridge here, so strong that when we pass away, it will remain as a sign to the wise. یکی رود بود پهن در شوشتر که ماهی نکردی برو برگذر. برانوش را گفت گر هندسی پلی ساز آنجا چنان چون رسی که ما بازگردیم و آن پل به جای بماند به دانایی رهنمای. And in fact, it was a daring project in that they wanted to irrigate this whole land. You know, the base of Sassanian economy was agriculture, aside from taxes, of course. But then they needed to build a bridge. So they built a sort of a weir here. They diverted the waters of the Karon. The Karon is probably the largest river in Iran, in southern and southwestern Iran, in order to build a monumental bridge. Here's a view of the weir called Band-e Mizan on the Karon. This is the one you have here. It's about 300 meters long. By the way, Shustar is a very picturesque town, and thanks to this watercourse, we have beautiful waterworks at Shustar, and they're now on the World Heritage list of UNESCO. Here is a view of that Band-e Mizan or weir, and in fact, this is the bridge, known as Kaiser's Bridge, or this was built by Romans, known as Poleshador I. This is something like 520 meters long. The bridge was in use until a fairly recent time. It was in use until early years of the 20th century. Of course, the superstructures are repaired or restored in the Safavid period and later in the 19th century, but the base is Sassanian, 3rd century. Well, this was a quick condensed survey of a few hundred years, omitting a large number of details for the sake of time. Instead, I have tried to concentrate on the idea of cultural interactions between the East and the West, the two regions that have contributed to our present human civilization. And this reminds me the words of the great English detective, Sherlock Holmes. There is as much sense in Hafiz as in Horace, and as much knowledge of the world. Thank you so much.
We do have time for some questions. So in the audience, if you'd like, there are microphones at the bottom of both staircases. So if you'd like to come down and ask your questions. We also have questions from our Zoom audience. So looks like we might start with Zoom. Yeah.
Started off with some questions from the audience, the Zoom audience, from our online audience. There are two questions that came up that I think you might be able to answer related to the Apadana reliefs or the Achaemenid reliefs in general. One is a question that is asked us quite a bit is, were these reliefs colored or painted in some way? And the other interesting one that I thought was, how do the modern scholars, how have they been able to identify all those people on the Apadana reliefs?
Yeah, yes, they were all in color. They were all painted. There's a thorough study of color done by Alexander Nagel. He never published his dissertation. I'm hoping he would do that. But they were all in color. We know that. As for the identification of those delegations, we have labels on one of the tombs at Persepolis, naming those people. This is a Scythian, this is an Indian, this is an Arab in cuneiform. So you can compare the faces and say, this is how we came up with identification of those delegations.
Can I just add that you'll see in the reconstructions of the palace at Persepolis, both the immersive and the online one, you'll see the reconstructed coloring of the reliefs. So you'll get a sense of what they would have looked like.
Hi. I'm just curious about how beautiful all this made with beautiful stone and everything. Are they get ruined by fire, by weather, by war?
There's no war there in the region of Persepolis, no. Fire, no. Weather, yes, but there's a conservation center taking care of the ruins or the monuments.
Thank you.
Hi there. I was just wondering if, when you were talking about the depiction of Babylonians and all of the other folks, why, if they were only always, if the default was only male, like where were the women, for example?
Sorry, I didn't get the last part of...
The women. I'll say it louder. The ladies.
Oh, where are they?
Where were they in depictions of a people? So, for example, if it's showing Babylonians and it's representing Babylonians as one man, obviously you're leaving out 50% of the population. So I just wonder if artistically that's depicted somewhere else, that's found in artistic representations elsewhere in the ruins.
No, there's no artistic representation of women at Persepolis. But don't forget, we are talking about 2,500 years ago. But we have the mention of women in texts, in tablets. And we know that some of them held important administrative, official functions. They held estates, lands. All this is known from the tablets. But as for the depiction, no, we don't have any female delegate. The only female, this is a lioness. I think that the Babylonians or the Elamites are bringing a lioness with two cubs. But aside from that, we don't have any representation of women at Persepolis. But we have the representation of women on textile from the Achaemenid period, from Siberia, so frozen tombs of Siberia. And we have representations of women on cylinder seals or seal impressions from Persepolis.
Okay, thank you.
That's my answer.
Thank you very much for a wonderful chat and lovely pictures. Appreciate it very much, Dr. Mousavi. You mentioned that weather and fire and other things have not been affecting these monuments. However, there has been quite a lot of information about people stealing and what is the chiseling out and taking out these monuments affecting that. What is the government doing to preserve them?
There is no stealing, as far as I know, from the site of Persepolis. And there is a conservation center at Persepolis with people who work on the conservation and preservation of monuments and sites. And there is an organization taking care of, in charge of that in Iran.
When I went there about 4 years ago, this was the talk of the people around that area. So that's why I'm questioning, because it's all open.
No, this is all protected. You know, this is all protected and with guards and fences, and this is very well protected. I mean, even too much protected. For the site at Pasargadae, when we worked there, it was very well protected. You cannot drive your car in the archaeological park now. You could in the past, but you know, so it's protected.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, thank you so much, Mr. Mousavi. The ruins of the remains of the Persepolis are still the same as it was during Pahlavi's era.
The rooms?
The ruins, the remains, the kharabaha.
Well, the remains are there, yes. But if you compare it with 40, 50 years ago, there is always a deterioration of the stone or stone structures. But the ruins are there, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
I was interested in your pictures at Ekbatana, and you were saying that there was so little there. Is that because there's not much that remains, or because it hasn't yet been excavated?
Both, because Hamadan is a modern city. When you have a continuous occupation of an archaeological site, a lot of things, you know, usually they disappear. In the 70s, there was a project. They bought up the whole archaeological mound, a tepe, and they raised so the present-day houses and buildings in order to prepare the site for excavations. And they excavated part of that mound, but they did not discover, or they have not yet discovered, anything from the time of the Medes.
Is there current excavation going on still?
There were excavations last year, actually. Yeah, a few limited excavations at Hamadan last year.
So we can cross our fingers.
Yes,
Yeah,
sure.
okay.
Thank you for the great lecture. I was wondering if you're aware of any artifacts from Persepolis in any museum around the world.
Artifacts from Persepolis?
Yes.
In any museum around the world? Yes, in the British Museum, in the Louvre. We have examples here in the exhibition from the British Museum. Yes.
Yeah, okay. Thank you very much.
Hi, thank you very much for your presentation. So I found most exciting about the presentation today the depiction of different peoples of the world. And it almost like evokes the idea of like a UN of sorts. But I'm wondering if it's me just putting my take on it, on the images you've shown, what was the purpose at that time to depict all these various people? Was it to show that they had subjugated a large mass of the world, or was it really to give equality and to recognize the different peoples?
Once again, both are valid. They wanted to show off the extent of the empire. And Darius says, look at the throne bearers on my tomb. Yes, this is the idea of boasting, but then at the same time, they recognized that these were contributing people and nations to the empire.
And was that unique for the time? Was it something that you haven't seen elsewhere being done, where they try to preserve and to recognize people for being different?
I think on some Assyrian reliefs we have the representation of conquered people, but it's not like at Persepolis. I asked the question, I asked Robert Rollinger, there's no precedent or precedence in the arts of that region. Not here, no.
Because the idea that we see in the cylinder is like the peoples of the world being equal, and a lot of times people talk about the UN kind of they take it back to that. So that's why I asked whether there was something.
No, I think that they
don't.
Persian kings, they don't consider those people equal to them, but the idea was to show that these people are part of my people. These are my peoples, my nations, part of the empire.
Thank you very much.
Question.
Any more? Well, if there are no more questions, it just remains me to, on your behalf, both in the room and around the world, to thank Dr. Mousavi for such a fascinating, interesting, and informative lecture. Thank you very much.